So if you haven't been with us, we have been working on and off. We took a break over Christmas, but through a letter in the New Testament. It was written by a person called the Apostle Paul, or one of God's sent messengers, a church leader in the early church, just after the time of Jesus' death and resurrection. His name was Paul. He went all throughout the Roman world trying to start churches or groups of followers of Jesus. And so one of the places he landed was ancient Greece, in the center of Greece, in a town called Corinth. And so we've been looking at the culture and the way this was all set up. If you want a good recap of the culture, you can watch last week's service, just the first 5 minutes of the teaching time online, and it'll recap what we've been talking about. We're about halfway through this book now, but just to give you a basic idea, I think the whole theme of this is honor versus humility. I think in their culture, they have been taught from the time they're little up to the present time that it's all about trying to get ahead, all about comparing yourself with other people and seeing how you measure up, and even taking opportunities to put other people down so you just rise up a little bit higher in society's eyes. It's all about making a name for yourself in ancient Corinth, and it's one of the few places in the Roman Empire where you can start with nothing and make a name for yourself if you're just willing to compete and battle for it. And a lot of these ideas are completely counter to the way that Jesus wants these people to relate as a community of people. And we're going to get into one of those things today, and it might even be a little bit sensitive for us in our personal lives as well, because it's going to hit on the area of our rights. I don't know, do any of you look at TikTok at all? Ever on your phones? Okay, not a lot of you, a few of you maybe. Maybe some of you woke up this morning and were a little bit discouraged because TikTok suddenly was MIA, wasn't it? It wasn't there. You couldn't look at it. But we're Americans, man. We have the right to have social media and to have TikTok there whenever we want it, right? Others of you, maybe you have other rights that you prefer, that you appreciate in this culture. Some of you like your Second Amendment rights, the right to bear arms. And if suddenly the government told you you couldn't do this anymore, you'd be tempted to walk out the door and open carry 4 or 5 on you just to prove a point. You're American and you have some rights. If you put up a post on social media and social media takes it down, it makes you angry, it makes you mad. If you were told that you couldn't get together with people, whether it's a church or your friends, you would meet intentionally and have a party with as many people as possible, some of you, just to prove a point that you have rights as an American. For some of us, if our Amazon Prime package doesn't show up in 2 days, we're about ready to file lawsuits and start a revolution because we have rights as an American, and that's clearly one of them. We are not good at laying aside our rights as people. And throughout the next 3 chapters, today we're going to do a quick flyover on chapter 8. It's 13 verses. And then next week and in the following weeks, we'll cover the next 3 chapters. But they all deal with the same issue. And it's looking at the issue of our liberty or love. And sometimes, as followers of Jesus, Paul is going to suggest that in certain situations, the Corinthians, and by way of application, us in our context, in our situation, maybe we should love something else or someone else even more than our rights. Maybe there are times when we need to love each other more than we love our liberties. That gets super uncomfortable for us in our society as well. And so in some situations, we should do something very foreign for many of us, and that's release our liberties out of love. But when would be a time to do something like that? And what kinds of situations? Well, that's what we're going to jump in today. And again, we're going to press pause at the end of our thing today because the next 3 chapters, Paul's going to go into detail and give us some questions to ask and some ways to evaluate when, even as Americans today, we should lay down our liberties so that we can better love other people in our lives. So we're going to jump into this. We're going to read the chapter and pause and work through some things as we go along. And we'll learn a little bit about their culture in the process as well. So chapter 8 in 1 Corinthians, it starts out this way. If you want to read along in a Bible or on your phone, you're welcome to, but I'll have the verses up here. He says, now about food sacrificed to idols. So Paul is going through, and the Corinthians have already written the Apostle Paul a letter previously. We don't have that. We don't know what they said in the letter. But because of what Paul says, he's in a period where he seems to be answering some of the questions that they posed in their letter. And because of the topics Paul's bringing up, we can kind of infer, okay, I think we know what that part of the letter was. I think we know what those questions were. And so we're in one of those sections where Paul's addressing a specific question or a couple specific questions that they wrote him about. And that was what to do about an issue of food sacrificed to idols. That's something that we don't really experience in our culture, right? Food sacrificed to idols. But in ancient Corinth, we know from archaeology there were at least 9 different temples in this, mid-sized city that honored different Greek and Roman gods, probably more than 9. And the primary way to worship these gods and goddesses would be to bring an offering, either grain or wine, or oftentimes a live animal that was killed and sacrificed. Part of the animal was burnt in an offering before their gods. Part of it was eaten at a feast that would follow afterwards. And those offerings were necessary to keep these different Greek and Roman gods happy with their city, with the people in the city. And each of those different Greek and Roman gods usually had a statue at the temple, and that statue represented the god, but the god was believed to be, outside of that. Like maybe it was a god that oversaw war, oversaw the ocean. So, in some other realm, there's a god out there. But the focal point of the worship was that statue to the god in the temple. And again, after they would offer these sacrifices, there were different dining room complexes. In one temple area alone, there were 52 different dining rooms that would seat about 12 people each. And then in some of the other temple complexes or near the other complexes, there were also dining rooms. So 60, 70 dining rooms around ancient Corinth for people to gather at after these sacrifices and eat some of the meat that had been offered in the sacrifice. The dining halls were probably open for other social occasions and business occasions as well. But eating food and meat that had been offered to idols was just a normal part of life. People would gather at these meals, and it was a good way to make connections in society. It was a good way to get to know other people and make social connections and try to work your way up in society, which again, as we mentioned, people were really trying to do. That was kind of the point of it in ancient Corinth. And so giving up something like attending these meals would have been culturally so inappropriate. People would have looked down on you, and it would kind of created a social disgrace. And so that's creating some issues within their church, though. Paul goes on, he says this, we know that we all have knowledge. And this translation I'm using chose to put it in quotations. And so they think that that's part of the letter that the Corinthians wrote to Paul. And I do as well, actually, personally. I think that that's a phrase that they use. They said, Paul, we all have knowledge. We all know some things. What do we know? Well, let's move on. And now Paul's making a comment, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. He says, when you have a lot of knowledge, your tendency is to get kind of arrogant because you have all this knowledge. But as followers of Jesus, we're supposed to be focused on love, not arrogance and our own knowledge and comparing how much more enlightened we are than other people. And just to kind of piece this together, it's going to unravel as we read more of the chapter. But what I think is happening here is that some Corinthians are frustrated with other Corinthians within this church in ancient Corinth. Because there's part of the church that feels really, really guilty for attending these feasts that occur in these dining rooms around the temple after these sacrifices to other gods and goddesses in the Roman Empire. And they feel guilty when they eat meat because it's been sacrificed. And there's another group of people that are saying, hey, look, we all know that these statues, these idols that are at the other temples in town, they're not real gods. We've come to believe in the one true God. We've come to believe in Jesus Christ. We all know this. We know that food doesn't have any spiritual significance. So why can't these people in our church be less sensitive? Why can't they just attend these social feasts with a clear conscience? Why can't they buy meat from the marketplace without asking 20 questions about where it came from? Like, it's frustrating to them. And Paul's saying to those people who are so frustrated, instead of making comparisons and concluding again that you have more spiritual knowledge than those people who feel more restricted than you do in certain areas, maybe you should focus on how you can best love those people and help them grow in their faith. And Paul's going to make a couple of points next that really help to challenge that specific group of people in the Corinthian church, but they also might challenge us if we're in a position where we think we've kind of arrived. Some of you, you've been followers of Jesus for quite a while, and you would say, I have a pretty good understanding, I think. I have a pretty good idea of what God wants from me. I feel like I know the Bible pretty well. I've been at this for a while. And other people who are here today or listening online or who are here other weeks are super new to the faith. And they would say, well, I don't have a handle on hardly anything yet. We're all at different places, but some of you would say, I think I could answer Bible trivia pretty well. I think I could do pretty good at this. I kind of know what I think about a lot of different things in the faith. So Paul's going to speak to that group. He says, if anyone thinks or appraises that he knows anything, like he kind of has good understanding of something or she has a good understanding of something, he does not yet know it as he ought to know it or as it's necessary to know it. And this kind of, I think, is a phrase that if we take just a moment and sit on that, it's really going to challenge us. Because what Paul is saying is, if we think we've gained a full understanding of anything, I mean, pick a topic in life or in the Bible or in Christianity, we think we have a full understanding of something. We still have so much to learn. I've had conversations with John Wolfe about this just privately, and we've talked about how, he has a PhD in philosophy, right? Those are deep waters to tread in. But we've had this conversation about the more you know you don't know. And it's like the deeper you get in, you realize there's so much more to learn. But sometimes in our faith, we kind of hit this, what we think is the bottom, where we kind of, we've heard teaching on something and we've read our Bibles and we've formed our own conclusions. But if we just start digging a little bit more, we'll realize that there's like a whole new basement level on this thing that opens up. And the Corinthians had kind of hit this false bottom where they thought, we know who God is. We know how to live the Christian life. We know about idols and about food. Paul's saying you got a lot to learn, both about that subject, but I think also about how to apply that knowledge within their own Christian community. So you have this knowledge. How are you going to use it? Are you going to use it to belittle other people who haven't arrived at the same knowledge you've arrived at? Or are you going to use it and direct that toward love? Another thing he says, but if anyone loves God, he is known by him. And it sounds like kind of a disjointed phrase. How does this tie in? But I think Paul is wanting them to kind of pan out and consider God here for a moment. Like, in order to truly love another person, especially somebody with a different past experience or different ideas or different convictions, as this specific group of people in the church in ancient Corinth had, who were more sensitive to eating meat or dining at these temple dining rooms, we have to put the time and effort into listening to and understanding and getting to know that person on a deeper level. And that was something that the Corinthians hadn't done. That was part of the knowledge that they lacked, that they thought they knew everything, but they didn't know those people. And that's what God does. It says, if anyone loves God, he's known by him. So in that relationship of love, it's a reciprocal relationship, right? For us to have a relationship, we have to get to know each other deeply. And God sets that example with us. He knows us better than we know ourselves. But the trick is to try to get to know each other on a deeper level. Because when we truly get to know each other, again, our response is a response of love, not one of just criticism or feeling better than other people really are. He goes on, he says, about eating food sacrificed to idols, then, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no God but one. Again, you see how this translation put those in quotation marks. I would do that as well. Ancient Greek had no quotation marks, so we're kind of guessing here. But I think that Paul's referencing some other statements that the Corinthians wrote about. Maybe some of their leadership said, as they were complaining about these people who were, having a problem with eating meat sacrificed to idol, they said, we know that an idol's nothing in the world. We know there's no God but one. Even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, I just think Paul's going back and quoting them and saying, here's what you guys are saying, and you're not necessarily wrong in that. But, and this is a great verse. I think if you were to take one thing home from today, this would be in my top 2 suggestions. So if you've tuned out, maybe tune in for just a moment, because I think this is a really great big picture verse to help us understand who God is. Paul's going to make a couple important points to challenge the Corinthians, again, to figure out some things about God, to put some of the pieces together. I put the question here, what realities does Paul state in this verse and why? Because Paul's going to give some truths about God, but he also is doing it for a reason. So let's read through this real quick. He says, "Yet for us there is one God." So this is Paul's little one verse of theology here. For us there is one God, the Father. Okay. All things are from him, and we exist for him, and there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. All things are through him, and we exist through him. And so let me just ask this. You can respond. What are some different realities or facts that Paul states in this short little verse? What do we learn? What truths do we learn from this verse? Okay, one God. What else? There's like 6. Okay, we exist for God. What else do you see? Anything else?
Jesus and God are the same.
Okay, it doesn't go out and exactly say that, but it says there's one Lord, one authority figure. And so if you're going to see part A, and then you're going to understand Jesus in that light, yeah, it leads you to conclude, and Jesus is God too. Okay. Anything else you see from this?
We exist through him.
Okay, we exist through him. Like, we're kind of dependent on Jesus. We think we're so independent, and we're just so in control. Paul's saying, like, check your reality just a little bit. So, again, if I were to kind of summarize this out, let's see. I got off my notes just a little bit, so I want to kind of go back on track here. Okay, so if we were to hit some highlights, okay, there's one God. Now, why might this be pertinent to the conversation at hand? Well, what have they been debating, right? Idols. There's one God. So why would Paul say that? Well, it is true that idols don't represent real gods. Okay, so Paul's trying to say, yes, I understand idols don't represent real gods. Everything comes from God. Everything. What's the topic they've been discussing? It's food, right? So does food come from God? Okay, if food comes from God, is there bad food? Right. I think what Paul is trying to lead them to consider is no, not really. Maybe people misuse food, but as far as the food itself, is it good, or is it bad? I think Paul would say, well, food's not bad. We exist for God. Well, if we exist for God, we're not focused inwardly on ourselves, which is what the Corinthians have been doing. They've been competing and comparing, and they're all about elevating themselves and putting down these other people that haven't quite arrived at their own level of spirituality yet. And Paul's saying, we exist for God. So if we exist for God, our focus should be on God and on loving people, not on promoting ourselves. He says there's one authority, Jesus, the King. So again, Jesus is the authority. It's really not about us. Paul's trying to lead them from self-focus to a life of humility and focus on other people. He says everything is sustained by Jesus. So look around. Everything depends on Jesus. At least that's Paul's point of view. We are sustained by Jesus. So our lives depend on Jesus too. We're really super independent, again, even though we feel like we're not. And so these are some just big picture truths to kind of humble the Corinthians that think they have everything figured out and that everything revolves around them. Maybe they're right on some theological issues, but at the same time, maybe they haven't realized how dependent on God they are. Maybe they haven't come down to a more humble perspective. So he's just giving them some big pictures to funnel them toward humility. He says in verse 7, however, not everyone has this knowledge. Some have been so used to idolatry up until now that when they eat food sacrificed to an idol, their conscience, being weak, is defiled. There are some people in this church, again, who are struggling with that particular issue. Probably a couple different groups. One group might be Jewish Christians in the church, because if you're a Jewish person and you're in a Roman community where there's idol worship, you're making all these connections to your faith that you have been taught from the time you were a small child up. You've been taught how idol sacrifice and idol temples are wrong. You've been taught how Israel made so many compromises because they worship these idols throughout the Old Testament. And so you've been programmed to see idolatry or anything connected with idols and idol temples as just horribly inappropriate for a follower of God. You also have people in the church that are on the polar opposite end of the spectrum. They are really, really new believers in Jesus, and their whole lives have been spent around these idol temples. And so for them, eating a meal is part of the worship set. It's just as much worship as you singing songs or praying to God might have been this morning. Like, it's a part of worship. And they're still so new as followers of Jesus that it's hard for them to zoom back and see the big picture of who God is and who idols really are. I mean, they know it mentally, that like God is the true and living God, and Jesus is God, and these idols are not true gods. But they haven't had enough time for it to quite sink in. You know, it still feels wrong to them. Their conscience still gets plagued by these things because to them it still feels like worship. They're just separating away from that. And so there's a couple groups of people that are really sensitive to idol worship in the church. And even though they might have the head knowledge, it just produces guilt on a conscience level for them. And so Paul's saying, not everybody has arrived at this. Some people, you know, their consciences are still struggling this, a lot of times because of their background or their upbringing in different ways. What we're going to come to now is we're going to start into a series of questions that we can ask to help us figure out when we should maybe set aside one of our liberties so that we can love and promote the growth of another person better. And so we've talked about some background things, but what kind of questions can we ask ourselves? And I like to use questions because I can't tell you exactly when to set your liberties down. This is something that God really has to talk to you about on a personal level. So I just want to give you some questions to kind of help you consider and help guide you in that way as you make that choice. Because again, the point of the Bible isn't just to give you a list of rights and wrongs and a list of to-dos. It's to invite you into God's wisdom and into a relationship with Him so that you can navigate life with His wisdom. It's not just to give you a few rules to follow to control your life. It's to invite you to experience God's wisdom as you step by step through your own lives. And so when should we set aside one of our liberties, our rights, so that we can better love somebody else? I don't exactly know, but hopefully this will provide a little bit of insight to help you answer that question for yourselves. So in verse 8, Paul's going to start. He set up the background. Now he's going to start making some observations for these people. He says, first of all, food will not bring us close to God. So for those of you that think it's super crucial in ancient Corinth that you keep eating, you know, at these dinners to preserve your social connections, and for the other people in your church who are really sensitive to that because of their past experiences with those religions or their upbringing in Judaism, he says, hey, food's not going to bring us any closer to God. This thing that you're so adamant about exercising your liberty in the area of, ultimately, it's not going to help bring you closer to God. So will exercising my liberty, if I choose to just say, well, I don't care, I have my rights, is it really going to bring me any closer to God? Now, there might be a scenario where the answer would be yes to that question. But in this situation, I think Paul would tell the ancient Corinthians, I think Paul's making the assumption that for a lot of these Corinthians, the answer is no. Like continuing to eat at these dining rooms, you know, even though other people, you know, are seemingly getting a little more than offended. We'll talk about that in a moment by that. It's not going to bring you any closer to God, regardless of where you line up on that right, whether you give it up or whether you hold on to it. Also, the next part says, we are not worse off if we don't eat, and we are not better off if we do eat. So will exercising my liberty, my right, will it make me a better person? You know? And in a lot of areas, if we're honest with ourselves, when it comes to our rights and our freedoms and our liberties, they're more convenient and they're more enjoyable, but they don't necessarily make us a better person. And so, again, these are just questions to ask as we evaluate these things in our own lives. Will holding on to that right make me a better person? And this is kind of where we're going to land today. This is where Paul gets into the heart of the issue in ancient Corinth, but again, we can make applications for today as well. He says, but be careful that this right of yours to attend the feasts, again, that follow these sacrifices, that right in no way becomes a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you, the one who has knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, won't his weak conscience be encouraged to eat food offered to idols? So the weak person, the brother or sister for whom Christ died, is ruined by your knowledge. Now when you sin like this against brothers and sisters and wound their weak conscience, you're actually sinning against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother or sister to fall, I will never again eat meat so that I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. And so, again, there's a lot of things in those few verses, so let's kind of walk through that little bit by little bit. In fact, I'm going to go to the previous slide. Okay. Be careful of that right of yours in no way becomes a stumbling block to the weak. So what Paul's dealing with here, I think in this particular situation, are the people who are really new to following Jesus. And sometimes the things that we do, people who are newer to their faith might be a little bit more sensitive in certain areas. And so this isn't a situation where Paul's saying, like, lay down your liberties because you're going to offend somebody who's been following Jesus for the last 3 or 4 decades. And they just have a different opinion or a different conviction on something. This is not that situation. I mean, those situations are addressed elsewhere, I think, in Scripture. But right here, this is somebody who's newer to the faith. And so when you're thinking about setting aside certain rights, this is in the context of like when you're around people who are super new to following Jesus. For if anyone sees you, the one who has knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, won't his weak conscience be encouraged to eat food offered to idols? Again, this is not somebody who's firm in their own convictions, who says, you know what, I'm offended by you, but at the same time, I would never do that thing that you're doing, right? I mean, some of you differ in your convictions, and maybe we'll pick some of those in a moment, but you differ in your convictions, but if I did something different than you, it wouldn't make you want to do that thing. Maybe it would offend you, but it's not going to like draw you into that. What Paul's dealing with are people here who are, again, going to be easily influenced by these other people who have perhaps been following Jesus for longer. They're seen as more mature in the faith or as examples. But there are newer people, really new people, who are looking up to those to figure out what Christianity looks like. And they're like, well, if those people are going to this dinner, like maybe I should. Maybe that's what Christians should do. And so they're pulled into that. He says, so the weak person, the brother or sister for whom Christ died, is ruined by your knowledge. Again, they're following your example, maybe almost blindly. And then when they do that thing that you do, they experience a lot of guilt inside. And Paul says, when you do that to somebody, when you pull somebody new into something through your example that hasn't had time to sort through and develop their own thoughts and convictions and opinions yet, at that point, like you're actually wronging that person. And you're wronging Christ because you're not considering that person, you're not loving them. But he's already talked about earlier that to love people, or to interact with these situations, you can't just rely on your knowledge of what you think is best or right. You have to love people. So you have to step into other people's shoes and learn and realize from them what they're dealing with and what they're going through. He says, therefore, if food causes my brother or sister to fall, I will never eat meat again, so I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. So Paul says, if I were dealing with this personally, which he's not, he says my choice would be like, I'm just going to not eat meat in this situation. Whether that means not going to these dining rooms and eating meat, or whether that means not buying meat from the marketplace, we don't quite know. But Paul's just saying, if I were in your shoes, I would just avoid this altogether because of how new those people are around you. So the third question that I would pose that maybe we ask in situations in our lives is, will exercising my liberty pressure or persuade a new follower of Jesus to violate one of their personal convictions? Because when somebody's just coming into the faith, they're importing things from the way that they were raised, maybe in a different religion or in other circumstances, and there might be some things that they just have had convictions about because of other things that they've experienced. Maybe when somebody's new to your church, they're coming from a totally different church background or denominational background where certain things were taboo. And so it takes a lot of sensitivity in getting to know people so that we can better love people in different ways in our lives. And different people have different boundary lines. I see this with my kids on different occasions. Certain things are very uncomfortable because of where they're at in their personal development. One of my daughters right now is very uncomfortable with sleeping away from home. For her, that's a big stretch. One of my other sons is really uncomfortable with having play dates at someone else's house unless one of his older brothers or sisters are there as well. And so in that situation, I have to step back and say, well, what would be more considerate for me as a parent? Would it be to force my daughter to go overnight and stay the night at someone else's place because I think it's going to be good to her and she's got to grow up sometime? Would it be to take my son and force him to have a play date at a friend's house so he can get used to being away from mom and dad without any siblings there? Because that's an option. But would that be the most considerate? Or would it be more considerate to meet them where they're at and respect their personal boundaries by not pressuring them to do something that would make them really uncomfortable, something that they're not ready for yet? Personally, I would land on the second option. And that's kind of what we're considering when we're thinking about laying down our rights and liberties for other people. It's recognizing those people aren't uncomfortable with where I'm comfortable, or aren't comfortable with what I'm comfortable with yet. And so I'm not going to pressure them to get too far out of their comfort zone because this is a newer thing for them. And they're still in this growth process, and we're different places as we're growing in our faith. And so I'm not going to try to pull them into this experience, and maybe I'm just going to avoid this experience that I have the freedom to do when I'm around them so that I don't make them as uncomfortable. Our past experiences and struggles and exposure to different religious teachings or traumas have shaped each one of our consciences a little bit differently, to the point that we actually have slightly different lists of what we think are right and wrong. If we were to write lists, our list would actually be slightly different. And the Bible allows room in these areas by inviting us to consider what's good from God's perspective. It gives us stories, it gives us teachings, it gives us poems, it gives us proverbs, but the Bible doesn't have a comprehensive list of everything in the universe that's acceptable and unacceptable behavior. It's inviting us into that. And because of that, we have to get to know each other well so we can respect each other's boundaries, whether it's because somebody's newer to their faith or they just have different experiences or they've had traumatic experiences with respect to religion in their past that might result in temptation or guilt or trauma. And we draw different lines. For some of us, it's dietary restrictions. Maybe it's for health reasons or for religious reasons or for preference, but we have to put boundary lines up. And maybe a part of us, letting go of our liberties is when we're around people who have those restrictions, applying those restrictions to the meal ourselves. I'm not going to eat gluten-free because they can't eat gluten. Or I'm not going to bring dessert because they're trying to cut out sweets or they have high blood pressure or high glucose levels right now. They're pre-diabetic. We're making sacrifices that we wouldn't have to out of consideration for other people. Other people draw boundary lines in different places with alcohol consumption. For some of you, you love to celebrate with alcohol. For others of you, alcoholism has damaged your past. It's been an addiction in your life, and so you have to stay far away from it. And so if you have the freedom, the liberty to consume alcohol, personally you feel, and you're around someone who doesn't for whatever reason, maybe we don't bring alcohol into that meal or that experience, or you don't invite someone to have a drink with you, again, if you know that about their past. Well, how do we get to know that about people? We have to get to know the people. And so that's Paul's entire point here in this chapter. You think you have knowledge, but you don't know each other well enough yet. And so we have to dig into relationships to understand where the lines are. For some of us, it's political or social or theological issues. And as we get to know each other, we realize we line up very differently on the political spectrum. And if you talk to people here in this church, you will find people all over the political spectrum, right in the room right now. Maybe it's social issues or theological issues. And maybe the most loving thing to do around certain people is to not bring up those hot button issues because you just know it's going to start a debate and an argument and you're going to hate each other at the end of the conversation. So because you know each other well, you lay down your right to bring up that subject in conversation with those people because you know where it's headed ahead of time. Maybe it's church practices in different ways. Maybe there are things in your church experience, maybe it's you believe in, or someone believes, that reading the Bible daily is something that's important. Maybe for other people, it's something like exercising certain types of spiritual gifts or speaking in tongues, and you realize those types of spiritual practices would make other people in your church community super uncomfortable. And so those are things that you're going to lay down that you're not going to force on people. Maybe it's something like fasting. Maybe it's something like tithing or public prayer or even volunteering consistently or sharing a testimony in front of people, public speech, God forbid. Joining an accountability group, having a church wedding, being baptized. The more loving thing to do would be not to force those things onto a brother or sister who's uncomfortable with that thing yet, for whatever reason. Even though in your heart you might think, oh, I know the best thing for them. They need to experience this. That'll really give them a taste of what Christianity is about. But we hold back because, again, we're considering other people's comfort above just where we're at. We're not forcing people into our specific perspective to have the knowledge that we think we have, because even the knowledge that we think we have is oftentimes very incomplete. I want to kind of summarize what we've been talking about just with a quick recap. These are the high points, and so if you remember just 3 things or so, these are the 3 things. First of all, if we think we've gained a full understanding of anything, we still have a lot to learn. Fill in the blank with whatever topic you have on your mind. We still have a lot to learn, both about the subject, because the Bible is a deep, deep ocean, and also about how to apply that knowledge within the Christian community, because we really have to get to know other people deeply, again, to know how to apply it in love. Second thing, in order to truly love another person, especially somebody with a very different past experience or ideas or convictions, we have to put the time and effort into listening, to understanding, and to getting to know that person on a deeper level, like God does. We love God, He loves us, but He knows us deeply, and that's what drives it all. Theologically, there's one God, so idols don't represent real gods. Everything comes from God, so no food is technically bad. We exist for God. We should love as God loves. There is one authority, Jesus the King. It's not about us. Jesus sustains everything. Everything depends on Jesus. We are sustained by Jesus. Our lives depend on Jesus, so maybe we should be a little bit more humble sometimes than we tend to be. This is Paul's advice to the Corinthians 2,000 years ago, but some of it's relevant for us as well. And then this bigger question that we're wading into over the next 3 times or so together: when should we set aside one of our liberties to better love and promote the growth of another person? Well, I don't know, but here's some questions. Will exercising my liberty bring me closer to God? Or is it something where, if I lay it aside, it's really not going to be a spiritual issue? On that same plane, will exercising my liberty make me a better person? Do I just have to have this right? Do I have to exercise it? Because if not, I'm just giving up something of who I am as a person, or something that betters me as a person. And then thirdly, will exercising my liberty pressure or persuade specifically a new follower of Jesus, because I think that's the context here, to violate a personal conviction? Not somebody who's been a follower of Jesus for 3 decades, because you're really not going to convince that person to violate their personal conviction. They've already formed it. They're already set in it. But newer people have to be a little more gentle with. Just like my kids, they're not quite ready for me to force certain things on them. It'd make them super uncomfortable, even though, from my perspective, I think, oh, that might be good for them. But they're not ready for it yet. And so what's the most loving thing for me to do in those situations? And this is something that's to be continued. So we'll close in prayer this morning, and we'll continue this topic next week at when we should set aside our rights to love people better.